Ms Jones, I understand that you and Ms Morgan are, between you, going to deal with the submissions which, if she'd been able to, Ms Scolding KC would have been presenting.
That's correct, sir. You've just ruined my opening.
I hope you will send... Well, let me not ruin it anymore in that case.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. As Sir Brian said, the inquiry was expecting to hear from Fiona Scolding KC. Sadly, she is too unwell to attend, and so in her place, you'll be hearing from me and Beatrice Morgan as the two longest-serving solicitors representing the Lead Day core participants. So to explain how we will approach these submissions, I will begin today setting out who we represent and the key themes that we will address. The structure of these submissions will then enable us to take you and our core participants and everyone here through what we say are the most important issues for consideration. And we have 6 main issues. Within each of these issues, we'll look backwards at what we submit went wrong, and we will look forward to the recommendations that we would urge you to make that we consider would help to prevent something like this ever happening again. We made a number of suggested recommendations in our written submissions, which will help alleviate the suffering not just of our clients, but we submit have the potential to improve the safety of the health system in this country. This afternoon, before the tea break, I will cover the first 3 issues. Number 1, what went wrong, systemic and cultural failures, including governmental attitudes. 2, the wholesale lack of informed consent to treatment. And 3, I will touch on blood products and self-sufficiency. And this should, if I have my timings correct, take us to the tea break, after which Miss Morgan will address you, sir, on the next 2 issues, which are, first, the absence of a proper blood management system, the failure to have a system of haemovigilance, which includes the failure of the government to have adequate oversight or management of what was happening, and the failure to provide adequate direction or systems to avoid it happening. And the second will be the lack of treatment to those who contracted an infection, with a particular focus on hepatitis C. And then, depending on our timing, sir, I will then either return after Beatrice or tomorrow morning to cover the final issue, which is the issue of redress. And then to close our submissions, we feel it's only right to end with our core participants' voices in order to recognise the suffering and harm that they have experienced as a result of this infection. And in doing so, we seek to emulate the ethos of this inquiry, which we know has painstakingly sought to put core participants' experiences and voices front and centre. We do not seek to amplify particular voices, but have chosen parts of the evidence that we hope reflects our clients' experience as a whole. We feel it is essential that the human cost of the infected blood tragedy is not lost in the context of our equally important submissions on systemic and government failures, but instead is considered squarely alongside them. So if you're in agreement, I would ask that if there are questions that you put to us that we cannot answer chapter and verse immediately, if we could come back to you after a break or at the end of a session, during which time the Lead Day team, consisting of Sarah Westerby, Sandeep Michael, Emily Campbell and Lauren Martin, will, I have no doubt, be able to assist us in providing a more detailed response.
Yes.
And on that note, sir, we start our submissions with gratitude and appreciation for the immense commitment and hard work of all of the infected and affected individuals involved in this inquiry, their families and their supporters, both those we represent and those we do not. Decades of tenacity from this community have led us here today. And it is imperative for you, Sir Brian, to act now, to speak truth to power on behalf of this community, especially in light of the submissions we heard last week from the Department of Health and Social Care and, in some respects, NHSBT. We submit that this inquiry has shown what our clients have always known, that those in power deliberately avoided the pursuit of truth and justice over 4 decades for fear of being criticised. On behalf of the Lead Aid team, I would like to thank all of our core participants who, despite dealing with their own ill health, have been unswerving in their support of each other and of us. We would also wish to pause for a moment to remember those we have lost and those who are too unwell to participate any further. We would also like to thank you, Sir Brian, Miss Richards, Miss Fraser-Butlin, Ms Scott and Mr Hill, and all of the other members of the legal team at the inquiry, the inquiry secretariat and the engagement team, and everyone who has worked on the inquiry. Our core participants wish to convey to you how much they feel valued, respected and heard. The process of this inquiry has been cathartic for some at least, and we have witnessed the creation of strong and enduring friendships. We very much hope that the collective solidarity and the bonds created during this inquiry will continue. And we hope that the inquiry does what it can to facilitate that process. We also consider, sir, that your positivity and tone and energy has set the tone which has led to the excellent rapport between all of those involved in the inquiry, which has been the hallmark of the past 4.5 years. Who do we represent? We make these submissions on behalf of 297 core participants and the Hepatitis C Trust. We represent clients who receive blood transfusions, who have bleeding disorders such as haemophilia or von Willebrand's disease. We have clients who have genetic conditions such as sickle cell or thalassemia, and who require regular blood transfusions as part of their treatment. The majority of our clients receive blood as part and parcel of one-off medical treatment. They receive blood for different reasons. Maybe they were having dental treatment or a minor car accident, or maybe surgery for a knee replacement. But by far the largest number received blood in the field of obstetrics and gynecology, usually after giving birth. And so Annex 6 of our submissions, we provide a pie chart that looks at the breakdown of the areas in which our core participants contracted their infections. All of our core participants were given the chance to contribute to submissions, and naturally their responses reflect a wide range of views and differing priorities. We have sought as far as possible to reflect those views, but we have not been able to include them all, or necessarily present everything that they wanted to say, but we very much hope that we've captured the essence for you. There is, after all, more that unites the experience of those who are infected and affected than divides them. All have suffered a lack of respect. At the core of the infected blood tragedy was a lack of respect for all patients, a lack of respect for individuals with their own values, preferences, and the right to have information to make informed choices about their own care and treatment. The right to decide what happened to them and to their bodies and to their lives was simply taken away, and it's that removal of autonomy which has been so shattering for many of our core participants. We try to speak, therefore, in our submissions on behalf of those who have contracted transfusion-transmitted infections in a myriad of ways. This inquiry recognised at the start of the process the need for an inclusive rather than a diversive spirit. And we are confident that you, sir, will keep this spirit at the forefront of your mind when you prepare your report. As I said earlier on, we will be addressing some key themes, and the 3 key themes of these submissions are disempowerment, dismissiveness, and defensiveness. We suggest, sir, that the evidence that you hear can be examined through this prism. First, our clients were disempowered by clinicians acting on behalf of the state, who deprived them of their autonomy and who took away their right to choose what happened to their body. We submit that this was a gross breach of trust and medical ethics. Second, their experiences were dismissed and disparaged or seen as a merely unfortunate tragedy. And third, our clients' concerns and questions have been met with defensiveness from those who caused and contributed to the infected blood scandal. And this defensiveness has been a consistent theme which has stretched throughout the inquiry, even to the closing submissions by government departments and state bodies. And it begs the question whether the government is culturally capable of behaving in a transparent and candid manner. In summary, we submit that the entire system for the administration of healthcare, from GPs to the Secretary of State for Health, failed the infected and affected. And we say that these failures were caused by a number of factors, the most important of which we submit were the failure of the state to have an adequate system of what we will call haemovigilance, which is the safe management of blood use in the healthcare system, the lack of any adequate oversight or audit of clinical practice, despite the government having ultimate moral, legal, and democratic accountability for the running of the health service, and the state's failure to take responsibility for the problems in the system or even admit that they existed. We emphasise what others have said to you, sir, that this was an avoidable tragedy. So, Brian, your report cannot change what has happened in the past, but it can stop this happening again. Your report can recognise the systemic failures in the way that the NHS was run that allowed our core participants to be infected. Your report can recognise the state's failings persisted in relation to the treatment of and the financial support for those infected. And your report can recognise the refusal by the government to act in a candid and transparent manner. What we have sought to do in our written closing submissions is to set out a series of recommendations which we would ask you to consider, as we believe they could make a practical difference now to all patients. We set them out in detail in writing, and so I shall not be going through all of them here. But I'd like to highlight the recommendations that we hope would: A, improve the way that blood is given in hospital settings today. A number of basic failings identified during this inquiry are still happening, which we suggest means that a scandal like this could happen again. B, to improve the organisation of blood management so that the system works together and has adequate audit and oversight. C, ensure those who were infected through blood transfusion, transplant, or blood products receive care that meets their needs, which is holistic, patient-centred, and comprehensive in meeting physical and psychological needs. D, improve or create better accountability within central government for the organisations for which it is ultimately responsible, and to try to change the culture of that organisation from a defensive culture to a culture that embraces honesty and openness. And finally, provide a comprehensive system of financial compensation to infected and affected individuals. So before turning to our issues, having heard and read the submissions of government and NHSBT, we believe it is vital that we emphasise that these submissions are not simply made with the benefit of hindsight. The DHSC, NHSBT and other bodies identify that the documentary record is incomplete and that with the passage of time, events are quite naturally reconstructed rather than remembered. And both of those points are true. However, the first and most obvious point to make in reply is that had these matters been investigated adequately at the time and had a public inquiry been undertaken when first requested in the late 1980s, then there will be far fewer of these problems. One cannot criticise an inquiry for being unable to recover information if it has not been permitted to do its job at the time when that information might have been more bountiful. Second, the fact that the record is at times maybe difficult to follow doesn't mean that it has no value. And we would suggest, certainly in comparison to many other inquiries into matters of the past, there have still been a considerable number of records that have come before you during this inquiry, sir. Both the DHSC and NHSBT also submit that we are looking with that when we are using hindsight, we are looking at the puzzle as completed rather than what it looked like at the start when the full picture could not be seen. We have not sought to impose a retroscope. The inquiry, most notably through counsel to the inquiry's incredibly helpful and detailed presentations, have amassed a vast body of contemporaneous evidence and guidelines that demonstrate that the risks of infected blood were well known and identified from in or around 1946 onwards. We recognise that seeking to reconstruct thoughts, views and ideas from the documentary record does have some limits. However, that does not mean that the information does not have any value, only that it is maybe subject to caveats. And we ally ourselves with the submissions of Collins that gestim is not an articulation of a set of bright line principles which have to be followed, but simply an examination of how one judge may go about assessing evidence in any particular case. And so, Brian, there is no doubt in the minds of our core participants that you are definitely more than capable of being able to assess the evidence before your inquiry. A public inquiry is not always about seeking to reconstruct the past through the eyes of the past, but it is about examining and judging through the eyes of today what happened in the past in order to avoid the same mistakes happening again. And whilst, sir, you may wish to grant a little benevolent latitude to those in the past, it can only go so far and cannot act as an amnesty to avoid saying that some things were wrong or should not have happened. And then on that note, I'll move to issue 1, which was to look at what went wrong, what continues to go on. We start by making some overarching remarks on the broad cultural and systemic issues that pervade the infected blood tragedy, and we submit continue today. You will remember, Sir Brian, the difference of opinion between the public health and administration experts, Lord Bitchard and Professor Pollock, on whether what was required in government and the public health administration was cultural, systemic, or structural change. And in a sense, we submit that the precise word doesn't really matter. What they agreed on unequivocally was the need for fundamental and wholesale change in the way that the government operates the national health system, and in particular, its systems for accountability. This inquiry is in a unique position, having surveyed the system of governance of the health service and public health over a period of decades, right up until the present day, to make recommendations for cultural and systemic change. The failures in this case cannot be and should not be seen as somehow unique to this particular inquiry. We see similar failings highlighted in other inquiries. And we would say that the failures happened because of the way in which the state managed and still manages healthcare in the United Kingdom. The government has created a fragmented system of healthcare with overlapping organisations, institutions and personnel, none of whom seem to consider that patient safety was necessarily the or even a primary consideration. There was neither accountability nor oversight by the government of what was happening within the health system. Because of this, there were no sufficient systems in place to ensure an adequate response when a virus like HIV presented itself. And there were no systems in place to minimise the risks of what we now know as hepatitis C. And we also say that there was insufficient attention paid to the continuing risk of hepatitis B transmission. There was a failure to ensure that clinicians on the ground were aware of the risks of transmission of infection through blood and blood products, and the fact that they were not, we say, was a profound failing of education and information sharing. Part of this was because of the radical level of under-resourcing of the NHS, which continues to this day and which we say impacts upon the decisions made. Excuse me. We suggest that the state has failed to recognise the culpability inherent in the way the system for the provision of healthcare was both designed and operated during the period in question. Instead of examining how the system could be improved, the government spent political capital and the past 40 years seeking to defend its decisions, and we say it still does so. No lessons have been learnt, and its continued defensiveness can be seen most sharply in the wholly inadequate response provided by the Department of Health and Social Care. For our clients, the continuing inability or refusal of the government to identify and address what happened makes it even more necessary for you, Sir Brian, to recommend the cultural changes we and others suggest, which includes recommending a statutory duty of candour. We say that the failure of government, in particular the Department of Health, to acknowledge their failures in their submissions is deeply disappointing and even insulting. The DHSC's response should be compared to that of the Scottish Government. I'm sure those listening last week will have acknowledged and appreciated the approach taken by the Scottish Government in their oral submissions. There was a degree of pragmatism and openness which was distinctly lacking from the oral submissions heard on behalf of DHSC on the 18th of January, whose willful and continued determination to respond to the core participant experience with defensiveness has led to a disappointingly familiar inertia. The DHSC failed to clarify the basis for the apology given at the opening of the inquiry. And the DHSC has failed to accept that things went wrong and have failed to accept to demonstrate that lessons have been learnt. The approach that the DHSC has taken in its submissions show that now, even after 4.5 years of this inquiry process, those responsible for making decisions centrally do not think that they got anything wrong. Their view is fundamentally flawed as it fails to recognise their responsibility for this scandal and the suffering of thousands of people, a responsibility which incorporates political and ethical duties, not just legal duties. The DHSC, we submit, seeks to blame others without recognising that had an adequate set of structures and practices been in place, this tragedy might not have occurred. The evasiveness and dishonesty which has characterised the public line taken by those in power for the past 40 years must stop. We have seen and heard evidence that demonstrates that lines to take were held even in the face of clear evidence that they were unsustainable. One example was the line taken about HCV testing, which started in September 1991. The line to take was that testing had been implemented as soon as it was possible, and that was the line that was trotted out to the public, the media, and even to Parliament. And that line was held even after evidence to the contrary was produced, even after the judgment of Justice Burton in A and others, in which the judge held that routine screening ought to have been introduced by the 1st of March 1990. And another example of holding a line to take was the refusal to open a public inquiry because there had been no wrongdoing and all the documents had been disclosed. We would submit, sir, that evidence before this inquiry, which we will not go to now, makes it clear that such a line was at best misleading and at worst a deliberate cover-up of the truth. Alongside this, we consider that there are still continuing failures throughout the health system, which this inquiry highlights. Blood is still used unneedlessly, guidance is still not followed or implemented, despite it being widely disseminated, records are still being lost, they're not kept properly, or they're fragmented and difficult to access between institutions. These were problems seen from the 1960s onwards. They still exist, and nothing demonstrates the failure to learn than the fact that these issues are still present in 2023. And the sobering reality is that should another non-screenable virus appear in the domestic population, there is a palpable risk that a similar tragedy could occur. It is the primary duty of government to safeguard its population Within the healthcare context, that responsibility rests finally with the Secretaries of State for Health, who, as Lord Fowler accepted, have a duty to ensure safe treatment as far as possible. Alongside others, they must take the responsibility for failures in patient safety. As I have indicated, it is our submission that responses of DHSC and institutions which they oversee show that they are still unable to recognise their wrongdoing. We believe that there has been a lack of parliamentary oversight and a lack of any attempt to accept accountability and provide redress. This inquiry shines a light on what we say is a significant gap in accountability, and it is a gap that allows no one to take responsibility, and it is a gap that this inquiry is uniquely placed to make recommendations to fill. It is all too easy for politicians to blame civil servants, for civil servants to blame other civil servants, and for nothing to actually change. We fear that tinkering around the edges will just enable further failures to take place. Wholesale change is needed. If one were to read all of the reports dealing with healthcare scandals, or scandals involving public authority behaviour over the past 20 years, one could see the same themes emerging time and again. Mr. Snowden, KC, took us to a quote from the Hillsborough report, but similar words could be extracted from many other inquiries and reports. For example, we note the following description used by the Right Reverend James Jones in his foreword to his report regarding the Gosport War Memorial Hospital. Lawrence, if we can look at RLIT 0001992 _ 009. Thank you. And it's just at the top. This report is a vindication of their tenacious refusal to be dismissed. It shows how they were failed by the professional bodies and by others in authority charged with responsibility for regulating the practice of professionals in the interests of patient safety. When relatives complained about the safety of patients and the appropriateness of their care, they were consistently let down by those in authority, both individuals and institutions. All failed to act in ways that would have better protected patients and relatives, whose interests some subordinated to the reputation of the hospital and the professions involved. As in that scandal and many others, we would suggest that the government failings in the infected blood scandal can be characterised as a failure to listen to the voices of those affected by the tragedy. Secondly, a closing of ranks and putting the reputation of an organisation above that of individuals. A refusal to be frank. What participants to this inquiry have called candour, and a defensiveness when challenged. Turning to the NHS, we submit that the NHS, from its very foundation, has perpetuated a system which has not respected patients' rights, including their rights to dignity, autonomy, and to make their own choices. It has adopted an approach that doctor knows best. This paternalism led to life-altering decisions being made without patients' informed consent. It also led to an approach to risk which ignored what was most important to individual patients. And we suggest that, at least in part, this patronising approach to the provision of medicine arose from the lack of oversight from local, regional, or national bodies. A view that they could not interfere in decisions made by doctors, even if those decisions were catastrophically stupid and harmful. It seems to us that the deference shown to clinicians created a system in which those clinicians could do no wrong. And when things did go wrong, clinicians and those responsible closed ranks. They denied and they put the interests of the system above the interests of the patients who were being harmed. In 2020, the Baroness Cumberland Review, First Do No Harm, was published. The purpose of the review was to make recommendations for improving the healthcare system's ability to respond where concerns have been raised about the safety of particular clinical interventions. Lawrence, if we can look please at WITN 732-8002_004. And this is taken from the Baroness's letter to the Secretary of State, and we're looking at the top paragraph when she's describing the healthcare system. We have found that the healthcare system is disjointed, siloed, unresponsive, and defensive. It does not adequately recognise that patients are its raison d'etre. It has failed to listen to their concerns, and when belatedly it has decided to act, it has often moved glacially. We suggest that the infected blood inquiry yet again shows how patients' concerns and complaints were dismissed and seen as moaning or neurosis. That patients, often female patients in particular, are seen as people to whom things are done rather than as active participants in their own treatment and care. Another reason why things went wrong, we submit, is because of discrimination within the healthcare system. It is vital that we consider it is vital for the inquiry to recognise the disproportionate burden borne by our clients who are women or from minoritised ethnic communities who have faced what is now known as intersectional discrimination at multiple points in their history. They were disproportionately likely to have been infected with hepatitis C or B in the first place. Thereafter, they faced further discrimination, demonstrated by the delay the majority suffered in obtaining a diagnosis and the misogyny or racism they experienced when they were trying to secure treatment or even just to be heard. And we appreciate that this is not an inquiry into healthcare inequalities, but the evidence heard demonstrates that treatment given to women, in particular during obstetric and gynecological procedures, often showed a lack of care and disregard for their autonomy and dignity. These issues have been referenced and replicated in every report which has examined how women have been treated in the medical system in this country over the last 20 years. When women sought treatment for their infections, the casual dismissal of their symptoms and the view that their intractable pain and ill health were just part of being female reflects the deep ingrained misogyny of medicine. And there is a growing body of evidence demonstrating that the same stark picture is appearing in relation to minoritized ethnic communities, and in particular women from those communities. For those from minoritized ethnic communities, the stigma of their condition, if they had a blood disorder like thalassemia or sickle cell, often made them seen as tainted by the eyes of their community, something that was set out in the powerful submissions by the Thalassemia Society. The treatment for their blood disorder caused the infection, which then created further stigma for them both within their community and within UK society. As well as the inquiry's work looking inward to stigma in these communities, it must not fall into the trap of failing to look outwards. The stigma was compounded or arguably contributed to by the relative lack of research or treatment options for these conditions and the systemic underinvestment and disregard directed towards these communities. So we'll come back to that point specifically when we move on to redress. Lawrence, if we can look please at INQY 1000 2500 and I think it's _018 at the bottom of page 70. Thank you. And this is from one of the affected who gave evidence before you, sir, on the 30th of September 22. Why are people not coming forward? Is it because of the taboo? Is it because of the stigma attached? And then being from a BAME background, being from an Asian or minority background, where language is also a barrier, not understanding what's the process, not understanding the disease, not understanding the illness and the side effects, there's a lot more barriers than the sort that we are touching on. As we suggest in our written recommendation, there needs to be wholesale work undertaken by the Office for Health Disparities and a detailed exploration of what has gone so wrong. And it's time for discriminatory treatment to stop, not just for women, but for all minority groups. And we would urge this inquiry to identify and recognise that what happened to our core participants and others reflects the need for real change in medical practice and attitude. And in fact, Sir Brian, you may wish to consider recommending an inquiry or further such work on health inequalities. And even after death, those who have been infected faced further discrimination. Miss Gollop Casey took you to the case of her client who was not allowed the funeral that he wished. The Health and Safety Executive's 2018 guidance managing infection risks when handling the deceased is still not properly followed. We hear of funeral directors refusing to embalm bodies of those with infections, refusing to allow family members to view the body of the loved ones who has just passed away. And so we would invite you, sir, to urge the Chief Coroner or the Health and Safety Executive to remind that those handling the deceased recognise the importance of the guidance and make it clear that the guidance is there to be followed. So we submit that there has been and is radical underinvestment in the health service. The system has been the subject of so many structural and organisational changes that are bewildering and do not seem to have led to any significant improvements. The government, we say, has failed to provide a long-term investment and strategy, and this was reflected by many doctors who gave evidence to this inquiry, as did those who provided expert evidence as part of the government and public health group. So, Brian, we submit that it is the government that is ultimately at fault and responsible for all of the wrongdoing on which we have made submissions. Its response to the scandal, both at the time and as the scale of the crisis became clearer, was pitiful and inadequate. So to return to the 3 Ds we referred to at the opening, successive governments' attitude have disempowered infected and affected people by ignoring them and leaving them with no or only very basic support after their lives were shattered. It dismissed calls for help, for acknowledgement, for an apology, and for a public inquiry, and there is no better way to describe governmental attitudes than defensive. The government, or at least the DHSE, cannot even explain what they're apologising for, and we submit there needs to be urgent system-wide change. And so to summarise, sir, we suggest that you should reach the following conclusions about the role of the government. And that is, 1, that blood policy was not given priority within the Department of Health. There was little understanding or focus on the issue, despite its importance. 2, that the approach of the Department of Health showed what we would call institutional inertia. And the approach was to do nothing until you had to, and then only do the minimum required. 3, civil servants and ministers were overly deferential to clinicians and were not presented with the underlying information to enable them to be able to provide effective challenge. They were only provided with the consensus opinion, and they were not, as we've seen in relation to the Galbraith report, provided with outlier information. I've forgotten where I am. I think that's 4. 4, disquiet and discomfort by elected politicians in dealing with issues about homosexuality, sex and drugs led to delay in implementing effective screening procedures. And 5, decision-making was based on factually inaccurate statements or matters which only told some of the story. The decision-making was marked by what we've heard referred to as groupthink and by the acceptance of a received wisdom. 6, there was a churn of ministers, thus not allowing for expeditious or consistent decision-making. And 7, when challenged, ranks were closed and there was no self-reflection or candour. There was the stubborn refusal to call for a public to hold a public inquiry. No one questioned or queried the lines to take over a 40-year period, and the government failed to create or consider creating a proper system of oversight, audit, or accountability for the actions of what happened in hospitals, which would have enabled the Department of Health and ministers to know or realise the failures that we outlined earlier. We say that there is no proper system of guidance or regulation by the Department of Health. The seven Nolan principles of public life, particularly openness and transparency, were utterly absent when it came to the government's response to the infected blood scandal. Other reports, such as the Mid-Staffordshire NHS Foundation Trust public inquiry, emphasised the need for leadership which recognises the reality of the care that is being provided to patients. There was inadequate leadership on the issue of infected blood throughout the health system, including within central government. And these failures we identify were ultimately failures of moral, political and administrative leadership by politicians and civil servants. And we suggest that part of this problem is due to limited civil service accountability. Lawrence, if we can have, please, LDAY 602_002. So this is an Institute for Government report of March 2020, and this part just sets out what the report is about. And as we can read, the civil service is central to government in the UK, but it lacks a clear identity, defined responsibilities, and a system of oversight and accountability. This report proposes a new statutory role for the civil service to reflect its permanence, values, objectives, and how it should be run and held to account. So we suggest that the concerns raised in this report reflect the problems that we have heard about and we have seen through the course of this inquiry that are systemic and inherent to the system. So we suggest that you, if you haven't already, although I'm sure you have, if you haven't already read this report, you might find it illuminating. The issues which we identified in government are so severe that our recommendations run to 10 pages. And we don't intend to list all of those here, not least because I don't think my voice would be up to it, but we would seek to emphasise the following of particular significance. First, a statutory duty of candour for all public servants. Second, the regular review of long-standing lines to take. So you'll recall Lady Primarolo, in her oral evidence to the inquiry, suggested that this issue could be remedied by a committee tasked with examination of the lines to take. 3, stronger accountability for the civil service. 4, a system for decisions about public inquiries to be made objectively and independently of the departments under question. Again, Lady Primarolo in her evidence spoke of engaging with the Cabinet Office or another department that is not the subject of the allegations as a separate body which would then make decisions about the inquiry under the Inquiries Act 2005. 5, patient safety commissioners should be appointed for all of the 4 nations with a statutory basis and a duty to cooperate. And 6, better cooperation between the devolved nations using the public health framework and health security common framework. And finally, in this issue, our core participants endorse Andy Burnham's view that the nature and extent of the state's failures require careful consideration by prosecutorial authorities. So I'll turn now to the second issue, which is the issue of consent. And we've heard thousands of hours of discussion about the issue of consent during the course of this inquiry. But we submit its importance cannot be overstated. Those for whom blood or blood products were not utterly essential would likely not have given their consent to them had the life-altering and deadly risks been explained to them. A huge part of this tragedy would never have occurred. But the government and other public bodies have in the past, and may yet again, seek to argue that for a large number of core participants, the blood or blood products they received were life-saving, and that their infections were therefore unavoidable. But sir, we would submit this is but a small part of the picture, which does not apply to many of those who were infected. And even for those for whom treatment was medically necessary, giving their proper, informed consent to potentially deadly treatment could have fundamentally altered their life. It would have allowed them to monitor for symptoms of viral infections, take steps to avoid transmission, seek treatment for those symptoms where possible, make lifestyle changes around diet, exercise, and alcohol that could have saved or prolonged their life. And for those whose lives could not have been saved, greater knowledge and information could have allowed them to live out their last few lives with their loved ones in the best way they saw fit, and to control their own death in the best way possible. The medical ethics experts spoke of the concept of an open future. Our clients' open futures were taken away from them because of a system that fundamentally lacked respect for them as humans worthy of being able to plan and regulate their lives in a way they saw fit. And with that in mind, we move on to what went wrong around the issue of consent. And the overwhelming evidence before the inquiry is that during the relevant period, doctors did not provide adequate or, in fact, any information as to the risks of blood or blood products to allow an informed decision to be made. And this is reflected in the 1998 National Audit of the Royal College of Physicians of the clinical blood transfusion process. Lawrence, if we can look at NHBT 0042240, and then just briefly at _003. You're ahead of me, Lawrence. I've always wanted to say that. We just see the aims and objectives of the project, and the aims and objectives are to collect data about actual practice. And then, Lawrence, if we can move on to _006, please. And if we can go to the top, question 5, informed consent. So the answer to question 5, no hospitals required informed consent for blood transfusion. The themes that emerge from the analysis of our core participants ring true with what we can see here. Almost none were given any explanation as to the risks and benefits of transfusion. It was rare that blood transfusion as an element of treatment was even discussed. And even if a consent form was signed, it did not reflect any explanation of the risks. On some occasions, our clients were told that blood transfusions were safe. And in one case, a core participant who was nervous about being given top-up of blood after childbirth because of the risk of AIDS, was told that the blood had been treated by gamma rays when they sought to ask questions to check that the blood was safe. Some of our clients were not told that they'd had a blood transfusion, particularly if they had been unconscious when it was given, and no one seems to have been given a post-operative leaflet or post-transfusion information as the signs or symptoms to be wary about. In particular, where clients had received blood on an emergency basis, there is no evidence that the risks of transfusion had been explained to them post-operatively. Ethical principles indicate that information should be provided after the event, and that simply did not prevail. Sorry, Lawrence, we're done with that one now. These failures were, as you recognise, Sir Brian, devastating for our clients. We submit that one cannot suggest that the lack of consent was something that was clinically acceptable during the time in question. And we would ask the inquiry to endorse the conclusions of the medical ethics expert group in respect of ethical behaviours regarding consent, including the provision of information and the knowledge of risks and the need to ensure that a meaningful choice is made, and that the choice is grounded in the patient's values and desires and not in what the doctor considers is appropriate for them. So why was this? Why were there such problems with consent? And it seems to us that at the time, the risks were not seen as relevant or important. For those clients who had to receive blood regularly, some doctors seemed to be of the view that patients were aware or should themselves have been aware of the risk of hepatitis. The evidence from clinicians operating on the ground throughout the period considered by the inquiry suggests that none of them, or only few of them, raised the risks of hepatitis as an issue expressly. Those who have given evidence admitted to a paternalistic approach to information sharing. It also appears that there was little to no discussion, particularly in respect of planned or elective surgery or childbirth, where there might be a need of blood. Nor was there discussion about, if blood were to be used, what the risks associated were with a blood transfusion. Whilst it's understandable that one can't have discussions about consent during medical emergencies, it should be possible, particularly for those who are giving birth at a later date or if they're having surgery at a later date, it should be possible, or it should have been possible, to have had those discussions and to have discussed the risks and benefits and the likelihood of a transmission earlier on in their treatment process. And we submit, as we've set out in much detail in our written submissions, that the inquiry should reach the conclusion that there is no routine consent sought for blood transfusion or the administration of blood products. Similarly, that there was no explanation of the risks of transfusion or receiving a blood product despite clinicians knowing, or despite the fact that clinicians ought to have known, that there were blood-borne viruses which could have infected patients. This, we submit, was a breach of ethical standards on a mass scale. Looking then to why might there have been a widespread failure to obtain informed consent? And We suggest that there was a widespread misunderstanding amongst medical practitioners at the relevant time of the importance of and the requirements of informed consent. And we suggest that this stems from the paternalistic attitudes, not just of one or two practitioners, but which were hallmarks of the medical system. And as the medical ethics experts explained to the inquiry, there is a common theme to many episodes in this inquiry, which is the lack of information given to patients, the lack of transparency, openness, and a failure to listen. All of those have been demonstrated over a long period of time. And so even in 2001, the NICE comparative audit in respect of blood transfusion, Lawrence, if we could have WITN 7001061_004. And if we can just go to the top to the key findings and 1, 2, 3, the fourth bullet point down. So although this is looking at the the percentage of transfused patients who were given consent, if one flips that, what it demonstrates is that 36% of patients in 2021 received no verbal or written information about blood transfusion and were not given the resource leaflet on blood transfusion. Thank you, Lawrence. And this lack of consent was not confined to blood transfusions, as can be seen for those with bleeding disorders. There was a lack of explanation and understanding of the risks of infection through factor products, which has been set out so powerfully by others in their submissions. There was a total absence of discussions or the use of alternatives. And we heard counsel to the inquiry asking on a number of occasions whether or not any thought was given to alternative steps rather than just switching off the tap, revision to cryoprecipitate or other alternatives. But sadly, no alternatives were used. It seems that clinicians were so eager to use the more convenient wonder drug that they made decisions about patient safety for them. Again, we suggest that the problem at its heart was that doctors felt they knew best or simply had no mind about what the patients knew or wanted. We suggest there are a number of reasons why doctors and nurses did not raise issues of consent on a routine basis. First, gaining informed consent takes time. Those who are constantly on the back foot, always understaffed and under-resourced, will not have time to spend with patients or to undertake the relevant professional development to keep up to date with guidelines and research. So you might recall the evidence of Professor Steer, who runs a large maternity service, when he gave oral evidence to the inquiry that the lack of funding meant that money was not spent on providing training, advice, and guidance to junior staff. He spoke instead of the charity Baby Lifeline, raising money for the funding and training for obstetricians and midwives, and something, sir, that Professor Steer rightly found as perverse. Our recommendations in relation to consent are set out in some detail in Chapter 3 of our written submissions, but our view is that the need for cultural change is significant. The obligation to obtain informed consent should be placed on a statutory footing. We believe that this can play a role in creating or even forcing the cultural change that has not otherwise happened. And we submit that providing a statutory footing can and does have an impact. So you'll recall Professor Hopkins, the Chief Medical Officer and Transition Lead for Clinical and Public Health at the UK Health Security Agency, gave evidence to the inquiry. And the reference for her transcript, we don't need to go to it, but just for the for the transcript and for your notes, sir, is INQY 1000262, and it's internal page 59 of that document. And during her evidence, she was asked questions about the duty of candour in the healthcare setting. And she explained that clinicians have always had a duty of candour, as it's set out in the NHS Constitution, that they'd always been required, if they had detected that something had gone wrong and they were involved in the care of that patient, that they had to speak to the patient about what had happened. Mr. Hill asked Professor Evidence, and I quote, "In relation to the duty of candour, your sense of how things had changed, is that a reflection, do you think, of the fact that the duty of candour became embedded in statute? Has that made a difference?" And Professor Hopkins replied, "Doctors personally have always had a knowledge of the duty of candour, but they may have felt it difficult to deliver within an organisational capacity. I think that the statutory effect in ensuring that organisations had a duty of candour as well has actually helped that progress forward. I think the duty of candour has come on and changed quite a lot over the last few years, and I think that people are now have much more often expectation of delivering it than existed 10 or 15 years ago prior to the Francis inquiry." And so you'll know that the Francis inquiry was a public inquiry into what happened at Mid Staffordshire Hospital, and one of Sir Robert's recommendations was the introduction of a statutory duty of candour. So that's what Professor Hopkins was referring to. And in addition, to prevent the disempowerment of patients and to create a more level playing field, we also consider that patients should be educated. Firstly, there should be a consent campaign aimed at patients, similar to the Choose Wisely campaign referred to by Dr. Murphy, which encourages patients to ask doctors important questions to avoid unnecessary medical interventions where they're not supported by evidence. And the campaign should be about shared decision making. Secondly, in respect of obstetrics and planned or elective surgery, we see no reason why a leaflet cannot be handed out during initial appointments to allow patients time to read and consider the issues, and then be able to discuss the issues during a later appointment. And thirdly, there should be an audit of the giving of consent. And we submit, sir, this would not cost much by way of time or cost expenditure. Already, patients attending appointments at hospital are provided with a survey regarding how was your hospital visit today, and it asks about the standard of welcoming and the food and it asks about different issues. And it would not take much, we say, to add a tick box to that form to ask patients whether, where appropriate, the risks and benefits of the treatment options or the operation that they were about to go, whether or not the risks and benefits had been explained to them. And then these surveys could then be subject to an audit. And finally, in addition to the existing guidance in the Mental Capacity Act Code of Practice, there should be a requirement for medical professionals who make best interest decisions, so decisions on behalf of the patients when the patients are unable to make those decisions, such as the giving of a blood transfusion while a patient is unconscious, that there is a requirement for those practitioners to disclose those decisions in full and discuss the risks involved. Such guidance should stipulate which healthcare professional is responsible for having these conversations with patients. The Royal Colleges, NICE, and other relevant bodies, such as the GMC, should be requested to amend their guidance in the same terms. So turning to the third issue of blood products and self-sufficiency, we deal with this in brief in our oral submissions. We set it out in more detail in our written submissions, but we do accept that there are many other core participants who are better placed to assist you, sir, on this issue. Our core participants who suffer from bleeding disorders faced much of the same mistreatment of as those infected through blood transfusion. A consistent picture through their evidence is the paternalistic attitude of the medical profession, which treated them with dangerous blood products without any information about risks being provided and without ensuring patients gave informed consent. So we endorse and echo the submissions made by other core participant groups, in particular Collins and Saunders core participants, as to the failings in the treatment of those with bleeding disorders. We would invite the inquiry to find that the medical profession knew or could readily have known about the risks associated with blood products, especially imported commercial blood products from the early to mid-1970s, that the UK was unnecessarily dependent on less safe commercial blood products due to underinvestment in domestic capacity and a failure to anticipate growing demand for such products, and that the government and medical profession wholly failed to resist the aggressive marketing by the pharmaceutical industry. So we say that there was robust evidence from the 1960s, which grew through the 1970s, as to the risks of blood-borne infections posed by blood products. So many of the core participants we represent who were infected through blood products have mild or moderate bleeding disorders. They could have been treated adequately with alternative techniques. At a minimum, the choice between treatments should have been theirs. The risks of the products should have been explained. Our clients were infected through blood products which were given to them wholly unnecessarily, including in cases where they had satisfactorily managed their haemophilia without such products. Blood products were prescribed for minor medical issues such as bruising or manageable nosebleeds, as well as on a precautionary basis. This attitude both caused and compounded the problems. First and foremost, it led to directly it led directly to avoidable fatal infections. But it also significantly increased demand for the factor products to the extent that the UK's efforts to achieve self-sufficiency could not keep up. Had the doctors warned of the risks, especially of imported products, patients might well have opted for an alternative treatment, which could have included no treatment at all. This would have reduced the demand for factor product, and we submit could have made self-sufficiency achievable. And finally, on this point, sir, it is important to mark the UK HCDO's serious failures in this context. Despite being a voluntary and unincorporated association, it was the leading body responsible for advice and information to haemophilia clinicians in the UK. The advice it provided, especially under the leadership of Professor Bloom, was inaccurate and dangerously misleading. In particular, in response to the outbreak of AIDS, the UK HCDO wholly failed to campaign for necessary preventative measures. It was uniquely placed to provide specialist advice to clinicians and to the government about the appropriate response to the AIDS crisis, but instead it led them into inaction. The UK CDO's advice to the Haemophilia Society led it in turn to give false and dangerous information to its members. And so the recommendations that we set out in detail in our written submissions include the recommendation to invite relevant pharmaceutical companies to publicly acknowledge and apologise for their conduct, and for the inquiry to invite the government to consider whether to seek compensation for from those companies. And sir, I note the time, not least because I've just seen you look at your watch, but in terms of our submissions, this would actually be a convenient place to break, because that's the end of my 3 submissions, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Beatrice Morgan, who will discuss the next 2 issues, haemovigilance and treatment. And then depending on the feelings in the room, either I'll return afterwards to cover redress or tomorrow morning. But sir, if now is a convenient time to break.
Well, we'll see how we're placed once Beatrice Morgan has finished what she has to say. She'll start at 4:45, and if there's time and a strong wind following, we'll hear from you again. Otherwise, I think it's tomorrow morning. And tomorrow morning, may I say, is probably more likely, because I appreciate that today has been quite a lot for people to take in. And I see there are some nods. So
yes, sir.
I would plan on the basis that you're probably not going to say anything more to us this afternoon.
Thank you, sir.
4:45.